I'll start the introduction. So thanks for your time today. I know we have a mixed audience of some blockchain experts and some not. I'm going to kind of go through and talk specifically about B2B transactions moving into the blockchain, which is a hot topic nowadays. Exciting topic, at least to me, hopefully to you as well. My background is I actually come out of Cisco systems and working in supply chains. Along with my CTO who's currently running crowds with me, we actually built Cisco's e-commerce platform years ago, which digitized raw materials into the final distribution channels. And as blockchain came out, we realized it was an interesting, really cool technology. As we got more into it, we realized this was really how we could solve some of the B2B problems. And so what I'm going to do today is walk through kind of 5 topics. One is what is called the blockchain revolution. 2, what needs to be solved in B2B in general. What's the problem here? I'm going to demystify the blockchain and talk about some of the hype, because there's a lot of hype and then there's a lot of not hype, and there's good stuff and crazy stuff and going on. I'll talk about that. I'll talk through where the adoption is today, and at the end I'll talk about, do we really need blockchain at all for what we're trying to accomplish, which is a question I get frequently asked a lot. So that's the agenda. Feel free, if you have any questions, just interrupt and ask, and then otherwise I'll try to leave some time at the end as well. So, you look at kind of these stories that go along. There was the Industrial Revolution. It really transformed how industry worked overall. And then along came the Internet Revolution. And, a lot of us, I can see from the room, a lot of us probably were there at the beginning of the Internet Revolution. I was as well, working at Cisco at the time. And then it all kind of fell apart. And people asked, is this really going to transform the industry? Is the internet really going to transform the industry? And then along came all these companies, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Ubers of the world we all talk about came post the crash that everyone said the internet was dead and going away. Now, blockchain nowadays, this came from an article in 2017 from PC World. Basically it states, blockchain, the indivisible technology that's changing the world. And you see a lot of hype in blockchain overall. Sometimes you see it being talked about as, hey, it's going to literally change countries, it's going to change money movement, it's going to change the way personal data is moving, et cetera, et cetera. It's changing everything. The question is, how much of it's been adopted and why is it going to change everything? And is there hype built into this as well? Just like there was hype built into the original internet revolution changing everything, and eventually it did. Is there hype built into the blockchain, but what will really happen to it? So the first question I want to ask is, what needs to be solved in B2B, business-to-business transactions? So this came out August 17th, 2018 out of Barron's. One of the interesting quotes, finance attracts most of the headlines in the blockchain world, but the biggest long-term opportunity may be in managing supply chains, i.e. paper, sell, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you look at it, take a very simple example of a supply chain. Now, I come out of a supply chain background, and so I apologize if this gets too complex, but I've tried to break down what supply chains are in general. And I find when you work in it, you understand, hey, there's these interconnection of all these piece parts that come into a supply chain. But when you don't, a lot of times people think of supply chains as FedEx, DHL, shipping packages, and there's a lot more involved. So take a very simple example of a chair. And it's not like a chair you're sitting on. This is even just a simple plastic chair. I did this in a talk in London at the Barclays Accelerator, and basically this plastic chair was in the audience. And if you look at it, it's made from a Swiss designer. It actually is manufactured in Germany, and the plastics for this chair come from mainland China. The raw materials for the chair from throughout Asia. Now think of this as a very simple example of a B2B, and all the B2B transactions that need to take place in this. In reality, what happens in this chair, about 300 documents across 20 different companies have to be exchanged, whether it's purchase orders, invoices, certificate of origins, bill of ladings, to get the chair from raw material to actually, let's say, a chair you're sitting on. A very complex process. And you look at that, and the internet revolution was supposed to solve all this. And we're still sending papers and fax machine and EDI, electronic data interchange, which is really when people talk about things being automated, they're referring to EDI. But the question is, has things sped up? Are we still having problems? There was a projection by Deutsche Bank in about June, and they said in the trade finance arena, about 100 documents need to be exchanged for a single trade finance deal to happen. And that's just financing global trade, right? And they estimated about 4 billion documents a year are traded just for the trade finance side. It doesn't include all the supply chain things that are going on. So there's a lot of stuff of paper. So what are the blockchain implications to this? So the first implication, there's implications for multiple industries. One, financial, and I'll show you in some data that financial has adopted blockchain faster than every. Supply chain, there's a big implication for supply chains, both in the money movement and also the product movement overall. And in healthcare, there's some implications there, especially look at healthcare supply chains. I want to just focus on the B2B implications as well. But one of the things you look at in traditional business right now is really, it's set up in 3 different ways. So you look at these traditional players, you've got document management, the e-invoicing guys, the Ariba guys, they do POs and invoices. They do document exchange. And then you've got businesses that are really processing the business rules. They're the big ERPs in between that everyone has to process. Now in this document exchange, there's also this group of companies that are doing these EDI exchanges as well. Then you have the money movement. You've got the SWIFT networks, you've got the PayPals, you've got the Stripes. Now, take the implication of B2B. What has to happen in B2B is all 3 of those things have to come together. I'll talk about that in a minute, but the blockchain enables more than just cryptocurrency. It's much more about that. It's much more beyond crypto. So what is a blockchain? I apologize for those of you who are experts in blockchain. I'll stay very quick, but for those of you who don't know what blockchains are, a difference between a blockchain, a central ledger, which most companies operate in today, a distributed ledger is what a blockchain does. So the nodes and the parties don't have to talk through and clear through a central clearinghouse. The reason why crypto is so popular is because you don't have one central control over it, like a central bank or a bank institution. It can go peer to peer. And the thing that becomes powerful with blockchain is it can move from device to device as well. And it can pass data, so it doesn't have to clear through a cloud overall. So it's very simple blockchain. The other thing with blockchains though, is that you can build apps on top of them. And for those of you in the room who know this and already building it, this is basic, but you have a concept of a smart contract that really are the rules of engagement. So basically the rules of how you actually bring things together, the rules on how crypto like Ether would work, or the rules of how a company interacts and pays different parties. That's really a smart contract. You also, on top of that, can build dApps or distributed apps. And they actually engage the blockchain. So blockchains like Ethereum, blockchains like Hyperledger, blockchains like Neo, and you can build dApps on top of this blockchain. And the cool thing about it is it takes a traditional app that you might build in Python or Java or a specific language of the blockchain, and you can actually interact that app with the blockchain at any given point, whoever is connected to it. So it creates a really interesting way to actually fix things. So here, the traditional application. So if you think about blockchain as being not just this distributed ledger technology, but this way to actually build applications that interact to this blockchain that doesn't have to go through a central cloud, but can move peer-to-peer to computers and devices and routers and wherever. An example, I was in China in September of 2017 talking about my company Crowds doing blockchain. Unfortunately, what happened while I was there is ICOs, initial coin offerings, were outlawed in China, as well as movement of crypto. And so people, when I was talking to them in September 2017 in China, were confused about, is there a difference between blockchain and crypto? Isn't this illegal? Was the question I got all over Beijing, all over Shanghai. Every city I was going to, people were asking me this question. In 2017, China basically had to come to grips with, whoa, there's a difference between blockchain and crypto. Yes, blockchain supports crypto, but if you look at this, let me go back to this other piece here. In May of 2018, blockchain exploded inside China, like literally exploded. VCs were coming after us. I got my HRVC and Nanjing signed us and funded a JV. The government was coming out with all these blockchain rules of what they could do and what they couldn't do. The government even came out with a stat, and this was sometime this summer, and it's hard to read here, but ranking blockchains, Ethereum they put at number 1, Neo's number 4, Bitcoin's blockchain is number like 16 or something like that. It's interesting, China figured out very quickly because of the regulations that there was a difference between crypto and blockchain. They do go hand in hand, and I'll talk about that. But China has outlawed the ICOs and the currency conversion of crypto, but they still love blockchain. So one of the things that this does and the implications for B2B is it starts to revolutionize the industry and bring together the document movement with the business rules and the money movement in a single smart contract that can be put out onto a blockchain and executed. And this really changes B2B transactions overall and really has not been possible until Ethereum. There is a problem with Hyperledger right now, and that the problem with Hyperledger, which is IBM's derivative Hyperledger, is it mostly doesn't support currency conversion and currency crypto on it. So there's an issue, they're working on that right now. But if you look at that overall, this brings together these 3 areas that traditionally were done, like that other slide, in 3 different companies. And that's one of the huge implications for blockchain. So what's the adoption? People always ask, what is the adoption? So classic Gartner hype curves, and Gartner published one in 2018, just last month as well, not specifically on blockchain, but where blockchain ranked. They actually put blockchain in 2018 into the trough of disillusionment. But it's interesting to look at what you go through the hype. So hype on the, if you don't understand, if you haven't followed these Gartner hype curves, if just a quick understanding of this, when the innovation triggers up, this usually is when media comes in. There's conferences like this, or bigger conferences, that this tech is going to change the world. Literally everyone talks about it. Then when the downside, when you actually start going this peak of inflated expectations into this trough, the media turns negative and says, blockchain, AI, I'll just use internet, whatever tech you want to put in there, hey, it's not going to change the world. It's horrible. Autonomous vehicles is one like that. Doesn't change the world. No, it's killing people on the streets, right? I mean, the same thing's going on. But if you look at where things are on here, smart contracts are pretty new. Distributed ledgers at the top of the peak. Blockchain, they just put in 2018 into the trough. Look at where crypto is. Look at where Bitcoin is. Now, what's interesting about this curve is that the trough really represents only 5% user adoption. When you get out of the trough, you're about 10, 20% plus. And we start getting out of this hype curve, you got 40% user adoption. It's really where the real business applications, the internet is dead. Remember that in the dot-com bubble? You know, the companies, the internet's not trying to transform. I remember all these articles when the dot-com bubble burst. The internet wasn't going to do anything. And then all these cool businesses came out that really transformed things later on. So if you look at where blockchain is now, it's right there. Now, you also look at adoption. And so basically, if you look at, this is a Gartner study about 3,000 CIOs. They were asked, are you going to adopt blockchain? 23% said, I've already deployed or I will in the medium or long term adopt the blockchain. Interesting. So if you tie that back to the Gartner, you're at about roughly 5 to 20%. You're kind of in this trough. You haven't had full adoption yet. You look at industries, look at what industries adopted it first. Financial. And there's about 50%, 55% that basically says either they've adopted in the short term or in the medium and long term they're planning to adopt it. That's clearly moving out of the hype cycle. And you look at financial, even though financial hasn't embraced it in the press completely, you look at where they're actually making investments and where they're going and what they're doing with things like Ripple and other things, which Ripple does bank-to-bank transfers and other things in the blockchain. You start to look at this and you go, financial's embracing it because it can move money, but these other industries really haven't embraced that much yet. Look at things like health providers, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, really where B2B is, they haven't fully embraced blockchain yet. But I think, and others, and I'll talk about why, that's really where the impact comes out on the B2B side.
Excuse me, I'm sorry if I missed that point, but when you said finance is adopting it, are you talking about the blockchain tech or the ICO, the crypto part of it?
Blockchain tech.
Blockchain.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
So that's a powerful argument for, because normally finance sector is the last to embrace new tech, right? So that shows a lot of confidence in the tech.
It's a good, and they're embracing it because, and the interesting thing is, no, they're not embracing ICO.
Right.
They're also embracing it to move money across of it. They might not be embracing typical crypto, but they are using it to actually move money too.
Right.
And so you bring up a really good point. Thanks for highlighting that. Okay. My mouse is doing funny things here. Hang on. So can all this be done without blockchain? That's the question I get frequently. I tried doing this at Cisco years ago. We digitized raw materials into the end markets. It worked for Cisco. It didn't work for the rest of the industry. The rest of the industry couldn't actually interact. It's interesting, even Cisco, within the last month, has announced their whole new blockchain initiative and this whole DevNet thing that they're actually doing, which is the first time they're embracing it. And they've been on several industry groups like the EA and the Interledger and the Hyperledger projects, but they're starting to move through it as well. But the question is, can you do this without blockchain? My conclusion on this is that you take an example of the supply chain. So take the chair example again. Simple chair, in that case, is a little bit more complex chair. You know, IKEA basically ships a chair and table, something like this, right? But what people tend to forget is that back in the background here, there's a bunch of sub-assembly manufacturers that are manufacturing things. If you drive further down into it, the raw materials, there's processed materials, and then there's the raw materials. You look at this from this implication, there's a lot of companies involved. There's millions of companies involved back and forth. Look what happens here. Invoices and purchase orders are passed back and forth, along with bills of lading and other information, all being moved by paper, some EDI, a lot of fax machines. I've been in companies in the last month that are the biggest companies in the world, and they're complaining they're still getting purchase orders through PDFs that are scanned, through fax machines, through phone calls, through emails, and literally traditional paper. So you look at that, and yet one of the things, this came out of an article recently, one of my VCs actually sent me. A lot of companies are interested in blockchain for creating more efficient workflows, but supply chain management is one of those big killer apps. And I would argue, when they say supply chain management here, it's really around B2B or business to business transactions. And coming back to this piece, what is the revolution of blockchain? It's really, how do you take documents, combine it with business rules and the money movement under a single smart contract, which has not existed until the Ethereums and other blockchains have come out. And now you can start to revolutionize and really make impact on B2B transactions. Because you can move the documents, the invoices, and the purchase orders, you can define the business rules that don't have to just exist in some cloud system that someone controls. The business rules can be put in the smart contract, and the currency movement can actually happen. You start to think about this on implications of global trade, it changes things quite drastically. So overall, my last slide, and I wanted just to open up for questions, but my last slide is just a plug. My company's Crowds, we're working on this as well. And I really appreciate your time today. I want to hear your questions and dialogue, and I wanted to save some space for some discussion. So thank you.